I wanted to say welcome and hello. My name is Erin Sidrovich. I'm the Director of Alumni Engagement here at Oakland University, and wanted to send a special welcome to you all for our very first office hours session of 2021. So Happy New Year, if that still works for you. It is just the early part of February. But anyway, we're glad that you could all join us. Certainly pleased that you could be part of our session today, which is on the presidential transition and the first 100 days. We are joined again by our esteemed colleagues in the Political Science Department, who I will be introducing in just a minute. But I did want to also recognize that this is a continued partnership between the Center for Civic Engagement, the OU Alumni Association, and Professional and Continuing Education. So thank you to those three areas. We're all very happy, I know, to be a part of these sessions, and certainly have been excited to see all of the interest among not only our alumni, of course, from my area, but our current students, our faculty, and our staff. We are going to follow the same format with today's session as we have in the past, if you have participated before, where we're going to go straight into, after introductions of our colleagues, we're going to go straight into a question and answer format. So this is really your session. Please feel free to submit questions in the chat using our chat feature. And I'll be monitoring that and sending those up to our panelists, and we'll be able to get started here. It looks like we have just a couple other people that are coming in from our waiting room. And so while we wait for that, I do want to take a moment to recognize a very special guest who is joining us this afternoon. Our president, Dr. Ora Hirsch-Peskovitz, is here with us virtually today. Dr. Peskovitz, thank you so much for joining us. I know we were thrilled to see that you were participating, so we appreciate that you are here this afternoon. And we're all in for a real treat with Drs. Dulio, Matthews, and Klemanski. So one quick disclaimer, again, as we get ready to get started here, the views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the authors and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Oakland University. And OU, of course, fully supports the First Amendment. So with that, we want to get started. I would love to introduce our three panelists this afternoon from our Department of Political Science, starting first with Dr. Dulio. Dr. Dave Dulio is a professor of political science, and he's the director of the Center for Civic Engagement here at OU. He teaches courses on campaigns and elections, Congress, political parties, interest groups, and other areas of American politics. Also with us is Dr. John Klemanski. John began his career as a professor of political science at Oakland University just a few years ago, maybe more like 35. He holds a bachelor's degree in political science from the University of Michigan, as well as a master's of public administration and a PhD in political science, both from Wayne State University just down the road. And finally, of course, Dr. Nicole Mathew is with us today again. She is an assistant professor of political science at OU. Prior to taking on her current role in 2012, she was a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions at Vanderbilt. Dr. Mathew has two bachelor's degrees from Iowa State University in political science and economics, respectively, as well as a PhD in political science from the University of Rochester. So with those credentials, you are all in for a treat this afternoon. Thank you again, Drs. Dulio, Dr. Mathew, Dr. Klemanski, for joining us. And I think we're just going to dive right in here. So I'm going to send the first question out. Again, for those of you in the audience participating, please use that chat feature, and I will monitor that to make sure that we get your questions in today. But the first question that I have is simply, how would you rate President Biden's first few weeks in the office so far? What would you regard maybe as his most important decisions to date? Let's start with you, Dr. Klemanski.
Thank you, Erin, and thanks to everyone who's participating today and is visiting us for this office hours. I would say so far, I think President Biden's done a fairly good job. I looked at a couple of the presidential approval rating polls that have come out in this first week or so, and they're all above 50%, which is, in this political environment, actually is pretty good. Mm-hmm. So I would say that's a positive. He did make this effort to have a bipartisan buy-in to the COVID relief package with those 10 Republican senators that met with him. He didn't pull it off the way I think he wanted to, but at least he made the effort to meet with them. I think its two most important kind of priorities are COVID, obviously dealing with the COVID relief, and the economy. And so, and I'm sure we'll be talking about some form of those policies later on as well. But I would say those are the two biggest, with COVID first, the economy second.
Absolutely. Thank you. How about Dr. Matthews? What do you think?
Well, I think the most important thing he's done so far is he's successfully made the US presidency boring again. He signed a bunch of executive orders that there were no surprises except the quantity of them. Mostly things he promised to do in his campaign, or things that were so boring that he didn't mention them in his campaign. He hasn't really had any hiccups so far in his executive appointments. And I would say probably the most significant difference is a change in tone, and not necessarily big policy changes, but I would say rejoining the WHO and the Paris Climate Accords could be like signals of where he plans to do things differently in terms of tone of America being more a part of the world community.
Interesting, you mentioned tone. I wonder if that's going to come up as a theme with our discussion today. But Dr. Dulio, how about you? Would you want to weigh in on President Biden's first few weeks?
Sure, Aaron. And thanks to the Alumni Association, thanks to PACE for being great partners throughout the Office Hours series. And as we'll get to at the end, we've got a couple more coming up this semester for folks. I think President Biden's first few weeks have been fine. I mean, and maybe that's maybe my choice of words there gets back to Nicole's point about boring, right? I mean, there just hasn't been a lot of craziness, frankly, right? And we've seen a lot of folks, opinion writers, talk about, going back to quote normal, and I think there's a bit to that. And in terms of biggest, the most important decision, or however that question was worded, I think the decision to use executive action immediately and so widely and broadly, really. I mean, there have been what, 50 or so of these that have been done, and which far outpaces other past presidents in how quickly they have gone to the use of executive order, executive memoranda to get some policy changes. And if we're honest about it, right, I mean, many of these were done to reverse executive orders and actions taken by the Trump administration, which commonly happens in a change of administration, right? One president from one party does one thing, and the president from the other party that comes in after reverses those. But I think it's notable the number of executive orders that have been used, and I think, frankly, again, and this is just a pet peeve of mine, right, is that we see inconsistency. When Donald Trump was using executive orders, Democrats couldn't stand it. But now it's okay because their guy's doing it, and vice versa, right? Republicans were fine with it when Trump was doing it, and now they're up in arms because Biden's doing it. People need to figure out whether or not they approve of or dislike the use of executive power.
Sure, that's a good way to think about it, right? Is this something that you're going to want to see continue, or is it only something you want to see continue when your guy is in the chair, right, with the pen? So I do want to offer again to everybody to please go ahead and enter your questions into that chat feature. We'll go ahead and ask those as we get through our session today. We'll get to as many as we can. But something, speaking of today, that is pretty significant is the second impeachment trial of former President Trump begins today, or has begun, so to speak. Do you think that the Democrats should have continued to pursue impeachment and a trial after Trump left? So I don't know, Dr. Dulio, do you want to take a stab at this first?
Sure. I think should is a subjective choice that all of our participants can make their own decision on that one, right? I think there's cost and benefit to it, and that's not just, and I think on multiple levels, right? I think that there's cost and benefit to the nation, where it's certainly a legitimate point to say that Trump should be held accountable. We should follow the House passed these articles of impeachment. We should finish the process. But I also think on the other hand, there's the point to be made. Is it really going to amount to anything? We really know what the outcome is going to be. So what's the use? And I think from President Biden's perspective, there's also costs and benefits, and frankly, more cost for him than benefit, in that this will slow down the agenda. The House, the Senate will have to spend more time away from what Joe Biden wants them to be doing than in an ideal world. So I think that's a real factor.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Matthew, Dr. Klemanski, would either of you like to weigh in on this question?
I'll say for the Democrats, I think that other than the using up time that could have been spent getting the Democrat agenda moving a little faster, there's not too much downside to pursuing this, because most Democrats want to see Trump leave office. And the other advantage for Democrats is that it splits the Republicans and forces them to take a position on President Trump. And I think maybe some of the Republicans are kind of eager to take that position, but there's a lot who don't want to have to make a decision like that and don't want to deal with the political fallout of standing on one side or the other. And I think the real winner here is actually the news media, because I think they're going to suffer a lot from not having Trump as president. And this is just an extension of them getting to discuss Trump, getting reactions from Trump or from the Trump world. And I think they're looking forward to a little more political theater.
Wow. Yeah. Right. What will we all talk about? God forbid, because we're going back into boring and normal, according to the tone that we've talked so far. Dr. Klemanski, anything from you?
Sure. I don't really miss the tweets, by the way, just respond to Nicole's point. I'm kind of torn on the impeachment thing. I think, the Democrats have a bit of an optics problem with this, although I think that it was probably smart to go ahead with the second impeachment. I mean, everybody's going to talk about the process rather than the content of this. Did the president really do something that was impeachable? In my view and a lot of people's views, I think he did. Whether that's going to happen, as Dave points out, it's not going to get convicted. And Nicole's point about Democrats trying to embarrass Republicans because it's going to split the vote. The problem is the Republicans who might vote to convict are the ones that you actually want as a Democrat in the Senate. The other ones are going to vote no, regardless of the merits. But the optics part of this is my concern. If people are going to look at this trial, they're not going to see the Chief Justice presiding. They're going to see Pat Leahy presiding. It's going to look much more like a partisan rather than a legal kind of process or procedure. And I think that is not to the Democrats' benefit.
Right.
Can I just jump in there real quick, Aaron? And
Yeah.
I think those are some really good points. And John, the legal versus, it's not a legal proceeding, right?
Well,
and I think that, and I know you know that. And I think we do ourselves a disservice by talking and using legalese, right? Or words like trial and that sort of, because that's not what it is, right? This is a purely political process. I think frankly, I think had this process moved forward a lot faster, I think there was a greater chance of a Trump conviction in the Senate if it had been within, say, a week of January 6th, when it was still fresh and it was still, an open wound, right? I mean, really, this point, it started to scab over a little bit. I think we've seen that from the House members and senators who are involved in this. And I also think, and maybe this will come up again later with something else we might talk about, but if Democrats bar Trump from running for office again, that's a huge favor to the Republicans, right? I mean, because he's less of a boogeyman if he's not on the ballot, right? So I think that there's, I think that's a something to think about.
So we're getting questions coming in. Thank you all very much for submitting them. Continue to put those ahead in the chat. Question from Emily relative to the trial. How might the issue or topic of Marjorie Taylor Greene play into this transitional time as well as into the Senate's trial? Thoughts on that?
I can speak about that. I think that Marjorie Taylor Greene is pretty, in terms of lawmaking, pretty insignificant player in Washington, D.C. She got assigned to some not that great committees. If you're a Democrat, I think the Education Committee is a nice one to be on. And if you're in the majority, maybe the Budget Committee is a nice one to be on. But as a minority member, Budget and Education are not good committees. And she's just not going to have as much influence in DC as the media makes her out to be, this huge personality, kind of the foil of AOC on the left. And I think it's again media grasping for some person to take up the personality vacuum from Donald Trump. So I don't think that she's going to have a huge role to play in lawmaking. I think she's going to be this figure that is useful for Democratic fundraising, and maybe she'll do well on her own fundraising, but I don't think she's going to be a big player in anything.
Well, I agree with Nicole on the lawmaking part of it. On the campaign part of it, I think you're absolutely right. If I were consulting with the Democratic Party, I would say we run against Marjorie Taylor Greene each and every time. Use the words that she's used. Use it for fundraising, yes, but make it nationalize the campaign, as the Republicans have done quite often themselves, and make it every campaign about her, because as you know, she's the Republican Party. If she can be tied to the Republican brand, then that's going to help the Democratic Party.
Yeah, I think in next election, you're going to see ads that say this senator voted with her 98% of the time. This,
right.
They're going to tie everything to her.
Yep.
And that's a tried and true tactic, right? I mean, we see that almost every election cycle, where it's whoever is the boogie person of the day is the reference point. Mm-hmm. And I think that I wonder if she doesn't get a primary challenge herself, so that when it comes to general election time, she's not in the picture. And frankly, Republicans in Georgia would be smart to do that.
As recruited by the party, Dave?
I'm sorry?
Recruited by the party, or just somebody who on their own decides?
Either one. I think, and I think the party could be either at the forefront of that, or they could do it behind the scenes, right? Which is, is how a lot of that stuff works. At the end of the day, I think she ends up being an answer to a trivia question more than some major player.
So we've got a question here from Jeremy. With large portions of the country supporting agenda items such as a $15 minimum wage, or any wage increase actually, expansion of Medicare, COVID stimulus, et cetera, why is there such a holdup in delivering for Americans?
Politics. It's it's more complicated than just saying that we do this because it's the right thing, or we think that. I mean, I'm not even sure I would agree with the assumption that there's a large percentage of the population that supports some of those proposals, but let's say there's half. But we're a pretty divided country. A lot of times the majority is, just barely over half. And so it's not always that clear cut. Now, there are some issues where I think there is a larger majority that does support that. But, politics sometimes gets in the way of these things. There's, trade-offs, there's deals made. It's the ugly side of politics.
Well, and I think too that there's, and Nicole probably knows more about this than I do. There's a process piece to this where, the COVID relief bill is moving through the House and Senate, not through the normal course of business. but through something called budget reconciliation. And that, we don't need to get into the nuts and bolts of that unless Nicole wants to give us the 2-minute primer on it. But and I'm not sure anybody really wants to hear it. It's boring. But it's an option that's out there for the majority in the Senate to use to get around the 60 vote threshold, right, of a proposed or threatened filibuster. And it just layers on so many other hurdles to get over that it stretches out the time that it takes to get something through. But I also think that they're still trying to figure out what they're actually going to put in the bill. I think there's still some, to John's point, negotiating happening.
Yeah.
And that's what they did with the COVID relief package, right, Dave? Or maybe Nicole, you could answer that. Isn't that what they just did?
Yeah, so COVID has started the process for reconciliation, and it should only take a majority vote to get it through, but there's very strict rules about what you can include in there. Some people are saying that you could put a $15 minimum wage in it, but it's got to be budget central. It can't be incidentally change the budget. It has to have the goal of moving the budget. So I don't think, and Biden has signaled that he doesn't think that the minimum wage is going to make it into the bill. But I think all these policies that have a lot of support, a lot of times we want to be like, okay, new party got office, and now they can do all of these things that they couldn't do before. And it's very hard to do wholesale changes to American politics. I think the better approach, if you want $15 minimum wage, fight in each state, in each municipality that you want it, prove that it has the political support, that it doesn't have detrimental consequences, and then you'll see it more likely at the national level. So, and you're seeing $15 minimum wage on ballot proposals throughout our country. And so I think eventually it will happen at the federal level, but I don't think it's happening this year, and I don't think it's going to be part of the COVID relief plan.
And Nicole, part of that is part of your thinking on that, the fact that the Senate parliamentarian may weigh in on whether or not the $15 minimum wage can actually be part of this reconciliation bill, because it as you note, right, the parliamentarian could judge that it is outside of the budget topic, right?
Mm-hmm.
But my question is, can the Senate overrule the parliamentarian with a vote, or is the parliamentarian's word final?
Right. Okay. So in order to be included, anything can be in the reconciliation package, but if someone objects that it doesn't actually have to do with the budget, okay, then it would go to the parliamentarian to decide. And this is a nonpartisan position. So they are probably not going to be just siding with the Democrats, because the Democrats have control of the chamber. So there's a few ways to get around that. One is to fire the parliamentarian and hire a different one, which actually happened in 2001. Trent Lott fired the parliamentarian. And the other way is that you can have a vote to override the parliamentarian, but that would be kind of akin to a nuclear option, I think. I've heard people talking about it, but I don't think there's enough interest among Democrats to actually overrule the parliamentarian on something that's such a gray area.
I now feel like I need to look up more information on the role of the parliamentarian. So thank you for that.
It's just more boring politics stuff, right? That's the new normal.
Fascinating. I love it. We're going to switch gears a little bit. We've got a question from Ray. Secretary of State Blinken has, quote, accepted Trump's recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital and the location of the U.S. embassy. Any surprise that President Biden has not spoken to Netanyahu since taking office? And I apologize if I mispronounced that name. Thoughts on that?
Well, I can't really speak to the embassy. I think maybe it's just a desire not to see it become this political football and move back and forth with each presidential administration. But I'm not surprised he hasn't spoken to Netanyahu. Netanyahu is like under investigation, also he's on trial, I think, also. Hasn't been able to form a majority government. Israeli politics is kind of a mess right now, so I can see why he hasn't extended a phone call yet.
You know, I do see why somebody might say that it's surprising that he kept that policy, because it taken so long for that to happen, because there were presidents were against it for so many years, right? So, but I think maybe it's a realization that that's just one less thing that we would need, as Nicole notes, to be kicking back and forth, right? That would bubble up to create a problem where maybe there doesn't need to be one.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think Biden's laser focused on COVID relief and on the economy. This would be a distraction and may get in the way of getting what he wants with COVID relief and with some of the economic policies that he's proposing.
Sure. Relatedly, we did get another question. What will the major foreign policy differences between the Trump and Biden administrations be?
Well, he's already taught, Nicole mentioned it at the outset, the Paris Climate Agreement is new. I think that's big. I think he's going to try to be more of a global citizen than we had with the Trump administration. And you'll see that in a variety of ways, including our participation in a lot of these international, multinational organizations and agreements. That's a big one. Maybe Nicole and Dave could speak more to some more specifics on that.
I think the biggest difference is going to be tone. Like Trump with his allies was basically like, you're slacking, you need to pay more. And I think Biden is going to be a little more like, we love you, you need to pay more. And I think same way with China. They both are kind of oppositional to China. And I think that Trump just took a harsher tone, and Biden will be a little more conciliatory. And then I think maybe a major difference could be like foreign policy towards Iran, where I would expect Biden would want to continue with the Obama foreign policy, and which Trump stepped away from the Iran agreement that was negotiated under the Obama administration. So that could be a major difference. But I think it's mostly going to be about tone.
Back to tone again. We talked about that. Just wanted to mention again, for those of you who are just joining us or have joined us in the last couple of minutes, please feel free to use the chat feature to ask any questions. We'll make sure to get to as many of those as we can as we continue through our panel today. I wanted to pull out another question here. This one is again from Jeremy. Will Biden endorse the idea of nuking the filibuster? If he wants his agenda to succeed, does he have a choice?
Sure, he has a choice. He can work with Republicans to get to 60 votes. I think that there's been, look, I think the speech that President Biden gave on Inauguration Day was the right speech at the right time in this context. And this call for unity, this call for, it wasn't really for bipartisanship, but that's, I think, how people understood it. And that's a two-way street, right? Coming together means coming together, right? And it's not, I'm over, you guys, you got to come to me, right? And I think that, John mentioned this about the COVID relief bill with Republicans. I would push back on that a little bit and say, did he really work with them? I mean, he had them over for coffee is pretty much what it amounted to. There's not one thing that he could incorporate into this COVID bill from that group. So I'm not sure that there's a whole lot of that there's a whole lot of interest in that, but he certainly has the option. And I wonder if it's moot though, because you've had a couple of Democrats, Joe Manchin and Arizona Kristen Sinema, say that they're not going to support that. So it may not even get to that point.
I think President Biden has a lot of opportunities to get involved in Senate matters, and I think most of them are loser type of options for him. He needs to stay away. I mean, he might take advantage of his senatorial experience and some of the personal, relationships or associations he has with current senators, and that could be a real plus for him. but there's a lot of opportunities for him to get involved. And he's staying away, by the way, on the impeachment, he's totally out of it. And I think that's a good idea for him.
Yeah, I think the getting rid of the filibuster, it's the nuclear option, because it's kind of, you have it in your back pocket to force people to the negotiating table. So I think by kind of doing the theater of we might get rid of this, that's what forces Republicans to start negotiating, because they realize if they don't, then something else could happen. Same way with starting the COVID relief and reconciliation. That's what brought 10 Republicans to the White House, is the threat that they were going to do it without Republicans. So I think if it happens, it's not going to be because Biden wants it. It's going to be because the Democratic senators want it, because they're going to have pressure to get something done, and they will not be able to get something done unless they force Republicans to negotiate or completely go around Republicans.
Do either of you think that any Democrats are thinking about the experience that they've had on judicial nominations and the filibuster being gone there, in their thoughts about whether or not to do away with the legislative filibuster? And what I guess what I mean by that is, are they looking ahead to the future, maybe, where they say, if we get rid of this now, yeah, we can do X, Y, and Z, but what happens when Republicans get the majority back, right? Because they have to, I think, know or realize that at some point down the road, they are going to be in the minority again, and they might want that filibuster protection for themselves, right? So do you think they're looking ahead or reflecting on what the Trump successes in using a filibuster-less judicial confirmation process is?
I think it's not that scary to imagine the world without the filibuster for Democrats, because I think that they think that the Republicans are putting themselves in a position where they're not going to compete very well in the future. And so I think that now more than any time, Democrats are going to be willing to get rid of the filibuster. And I think the experience of the last 10, 15 years of where the Senate is basically a place where things go to die, I think that experience is going to make them want to make Senate rules more workable, so that they can be more productive and take more of a center stage in policy making. So I think they're going to be willing to get rid of it, even if it means that Republicans will be able to legislate without the filibuster in the future.
Isn't that what the Senate was supposed to be? Right. I mean, that in one art, right? It's and there's this horrendous political science comparison that is often used, that the U.S. House of Representatives is this teacup that holds this hot tea, and then when it spills over, it falls into the saucer that is the Senate, where things go to cool down, right? And so that's kind of the way the Senate has always been, or it's designed to be a place of cooler, calmer heads. So I certainly it has more likely to be the place where legislation doesn't get picked up and things go to die. But I think you could also find examples of legislation the Senate's passed that has not been picked up by the House either.
So sorry, Dr. Klemanski, did you have something else?
I was just going to say, Dave's question was about, do politicians look forward enough so that they might fear retribution in the future? Politicians famously don't think very far in the future, do they? But I do see the point. I think that's probably always in the back of your mind that, of course, someday we're going to be in the minority again. So how much that affects their behavior, I don't know.
Let's expand a little bit on this bipartisan discussion. And we do have a question from Tom. He says, there's frequent talk about taking a bipartisan or nonpartisan approach to policy decisions. But does bipartisan really work? Does America care about the middle? Can someone get elected on being bipartisan or in the middle? And he does add in parentheses, I would like to think so. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I will say that there is a difference between being moderate and being bipartisan. You can say that you want to be bipartisan all day long, but it takes two to tango. And if the other party doesn't want to be bipartisan with you, it doesn't matter. So I think if you're a politician, don't make bipartisanship the goal, make moderation, being mainstream, doing things the American people want, make that the goal. Force the other party to oppose you on things that are mainstream, that are popular. And I think that's how we'll get to bipartisanship, not by starting out by saying, I'm only going to do things that are bipartisan. Then you give the other party the opportunity to hold your agenda hostage just by withdrawing their support.
Well, and now that you mention that, Nicole, I think, I said before that I think the speech that the president gave on Inauguration Day was about unity was interpreted to mean bipartisan. And whether or not that's what he meant is beside the point. But we saw him say, it was either a week or two after, he said, look, we can be unified, but that doesn't mean it's got to be bipartisan, right? So I think he's realizing, or he's making your point, right? That it does take two to tango. It is a two-way street. And I think that it's a hard thing to do, right? When, especially when we've had partisans in both chambers on both sides, entrenched in their corners for so long, and when they might pay a political price for coming out of that corner, right? I mean, they might get primaried from the edges of their party the next time around. So it can be a dangerous political move.
Yeah, a lot of moderates got primaried out. There's not many of either party left because of the way we've run elections and the polarization that exists. However, I will point out that we do have this problem-solving committee in the House, and Alyssa Slotkin, who's a House member from this area, is a member of that. One of the requirements is, if you want to be on this bipartisan committee, you actually have to bring in somebody from the other party into the committee. So it's got at least some built-in kind of structure for bipartisanship, which I think is, and I'm sure it's a response to this hyper polarization that has existed over the last 20 or 30 years.
So it's interesting you mentioned the Problem Solvers Caucus, John, because I think there are currently 55 members of that group, or 56, because it's got to be 56. But 5 of them are from Michigan. We have 5 members of the Problem Solvers Caucus, which I think is a good sign for our state. You've got Slotkin, Stevens, Dingell, Upton, and Meyer are all, well, some of them are new members, but I think that's a good thing for our state, and it shows that there are some pragmatists in our congressional delegation.
Do you think it's also because at least some of them are from competitive districts?
You'd have to think so, right? That's a good move for them to at least try and show that they are working in a bipartisan way, right? Nicole and I could get into Richard Fenno here in advertising and things like that, but that's for a class on Congress.
We're getting some great questions coming in still. So again, to those of you in the audience, please go ahead and use that chat feature and we'll get to your questions. This one is going to switch gears a little bit. If Biden wants to pack the Supreme Court, what would it take? How likely is he to take this action? Does he need approval from Congress? And that comes from Masara.
I don't see that happening. I mean, I think this was coming from other members of the Democratic Party, and that was with frustration over the Kavanaugh kind of nomination in part. So I heard a lot of talk about that. I'm not sure I ever heard Biden talk about it, except I think he did say he wasn't interested necessarily in that. So I just don't think it's going to happen.
Well, I think there's, to answer the question, yes, it would take Congress to do something. They would need to amend the controlling statute that sets the number of justices on the Supreme Court at 9, which I think is 150 years old. roughly speaking. But in order to do that, they would need to get rid of the legislative filibuster, right? So there's a process that because there's no way Republicans are going to go from that. And that's one of those issues where I think Democrats would worry about, or they would be smart to worry about, what would happen if they got rid of the filibuster, because you could see that one, and Nicole mentioned this in a previous answer, right? This political football, but you could see every 4 or 8 years where 3 more justices are added by the party that comes into power, right? And I think that would, and we might end up with a 47-member Supreme Court down the road.
Well, you said there's 56 in the problem solving caucus. So do we want to work it up to that? Other thoughts on that question? Dr. Matthew, did you have something?
Yeah, I was just going to say that it is a lot easier to change the size of the Supreme Court than people think. It's not in the Constitution how many members of the Supreme Court there are. And it's basically political norms that keep it the size that it is. And I think we've seen over the last few years how many things in this country are held together just by political norms and not necessarily by laws or by the Constitution. So it would be a big line to cross to change the number in the Supreme Court, and it would definitely require getting rid of the filibuster to do it. But it is a lot easier than amending the Constitution, and it's kind of odd that the founders didn't put the number of justices in the Constitution. I think they ran out of steam at the Constitutional Convention when they got to the judicial branch, and they didn't put a whole lot of thought into it.
So it makes this topic so fascinating, right? Traditions and norms, how they have been challenged of late. And it makes you think about, yes, 150 years ago, what was going around. So we've got another question here from Tanner. What explains rising levels of voter mistrust in election integrity?
How much time do we have?
That's a whole other session, Tanner. Now, what do you think, Dr. Dulio?
Oh, I think there are so many factors and dynamics there, right? Certainly, certain candidates or elected officials messaging on that topic. I think social media has been a huge avenue for that kind of information to be spread around, or at least those arguments to be made. And I don't want that to be interpreted a way that I don't want it to be, because I think there are real arguments and real questions to be asked about what information can be shared, what information cannot be shared. I think that's a really thorny issue to take up, and some serious sort of, frankly, democracy related questions that surround that.
Well, remember, election law is made by states too. And if you, I just saw an article in the paper, I think today, that there were 2 Republican state legislators in Michigan who were sponsoring an election reform bill that actually is being endorsed by Jocelyn Benson, the Democratic Attorney General, and it had to do with cleaning up the qualified voter file and some things like that. So this actually might be an area where you can get some satisfactory reform that both sides can agree on.
And John, what do you mean by cleaning up the qualified voter file?
Well, there's some inconsistencies. One of the problems was that when somebody was certified as an eligible voter, but they didn't have their birth date information, there would be a placeholder date, like 1900 would be the year they were born, which of course, people are going, how can somebody be born in 1900 and still be voting in 2020? So some of that just has to be kind of, it's a technical question, but it led the people who were distrusting already the election process to think that there were some, dead people voting, or there were some, inaccuracies or fraud or whatever they were thinking.
We're gonna switch gears and head to a question here from Dr. Maxfield. Hi, Dr. Maxfield. Thanks for joining us. What role is VP Harris likely to play?
Well, for one, she has to break all the ties in the Senate. We've got a 50-50 divide between Republicans and Democrats. And so unless someone switches parties or someone dies, she will be needed to break all those ties. I think that she might have probably a big role just as the face of the administration. She's a very popular person, and I think a lot of people will want to see her at events. So I think she'll have a heavy travel schedule. And perhaps she might be involved in kind of some Senate liaison, arm twist, not necessarily arm twisting, who twists arms anymore, but persuasion efforts to get senators on board. So we'll see.
I think it's interesting you mentioned that, Nicole. I read the other day that that the vice president has been at and in the picture of every executive order that the president has signed, and that she's been there by his side. And I think that that gets to your point about being a face of the administration. I think that they are clearly trying to use her in that sort of public relations mode. And I think in a lot of ways, she can make her role whatever she wants it to be. I think she's going to have a lot of leeway and be able to go to the president and say, hey, look, I'd like to do X, Y, or Z. And I think he's going to let her. Hi, Bob. Thanks for being here.
President Biden had a pretty active role as vice president in the Obama administration. I think he probably will see that as a model. And he certainly sees the assets that Kamala Harris brings to the administration, and he'll use them as much as he can.
So definitely wanted to offer for our audience again to please add your questions to the chat. We still have some time here before our office hours session is over. So please add those in. We do have a question from Dante. The concern of the vaccines is high in minority communities, as we've seen in the past with remembrance of the Tuskegee experiment. How does the Biden-Harris administration go about increasing the trust of the vaccine in the minority community in these first 100 days?
Well, currently, I think the problem is not vaccine hesitancy, it is vaccine availability. And I think the hesitancy will go away once people see and know other people in their community that got a vaccine. So I think solving the problem of getting the vaccine to these communities, they say even now when they have clinics that are in counties or places that have high minority populations, a lot of white people entering that area to get a vaccine. So I think it's just going to be a matter of making the vaccines available, and then eventually people will decide to get them.
Yeah, I would agree that one thing that might help is just to have maybe some higher profile minority individuals to publicly get their vaccination, and so that folks might see that this is going to be okay for them, and might reduce the anxiety over, with the implications of the vaccination, as Tuskegee might have, that some folks still might think about that.
I think that I agree with all of that, but I do think Dante makes a good point, and I think that concern, nervousness, anxiety about the vaccine in minority populations, I think it's a real thing. I think that is, and I think that there is some real trepidation for a number of reasons. And I think the way to solve it is transparency. I hate to put it this way, but messaging, right? And that gets to John's point about high profile individuals from minority communities getting the vaccine. But I think it's got to be talking about the vaccine, and that's where the transparency comes to explain it, get good information to folks. It's been a couple of weeks now, but we did a nice partnership from the Center for Civic Engagement, Center for Religious Understanding, Center for Public Humanities. We did a vaccine panel And we included a pastor from the city of Pontiac to talk about the experience that he has in talking to his congregation about these issues, right? And it's tough. And that was kind of the message. One of the messages that he relayed to us was it can be a difficult conversation. It can be a difficult thing to do to convince people of something that they've been concerned about for so long.
Yeah, that was a great panel too, precisely because it dealt with all of that information. We do have a couple more questions. This comes from Jeremy. What is the likelihood we get student debt relief? Asking for a friend, he says.
Boy, that is a huge issue. Folks, our students often are saddled with huge debts by the time they graduate. And I would add, maybe to double down on that a little bit, I have personally known some of my students in like intro classes and so on, who actually ended up not being able to afford the remaining 2 years of their college. So they're in a situation where they not only have debt, but they don't have a college degree. So that's doubly a problem. But I think something's got to give. College is very expensive. More scholarships we need. We need to figure out how to pay for college. And it's a major problem. It is a huge problem.
It is, John, and I think too that this is a good, maybe it's sort of a plug for our department, but we had a colleague from years ago, Shelley Appleton, who created an endowment to help try and solve some of these problems, to be able to buy textbooks for students who couldn't afford them, and we do that every semester as a department. We are able to purchase textbooks because of Shelley's generosity. We have scholarships like the Finish Line Scholarship in the College of Arts and Sciences that help students get over that last little bit, take those last couple of courses. So, and that's a way that philanthropy here at OU is has such an impact, right? Where it can be the difference between somebody finishing and not finishing, where then they've got, and going from somebody with debt and no degree to at least having that college degree. I find it interesting, the debate about whether or not this gets done, because the stories that I've read are that the president could do this with a stroke of a pen and wipe out $50,000 of college debt just like that. But I also find it interesting that the politics around it are changing, where now you're seeing some folks from the left argue that would be a giveaway to wealthy people. And whether or not that's right or wrong is not for me to answer. But I think that the political winds are stronger or from more directions than we might think on this one.
I think there's a lot that could be done by executive action, like Dave was saying. We currently have a program that says if you, pay your debt on time for 10 years and you work in the public sector for a nonprofit, that your debt can be wiped out. And it is not implemented well, and barely anyone who on law, like legally qualifies for it, barely anyone is actually able to eliminate their debt. And that is just like an administrative thing that could be solved easily. And there's a lot of things that could be done, like getting people into making the default payment plan to be income based. Like a lot of that can be done just by executive order. A wholesale canceling of all debts, I don't think it's going to happen, because as Dave mentioned, especially like graduate school debt is mostly held by people who are middle class or will be middle class once they get their law degree. So I don't think that's going to happen. But more for undergraduate debt, I think could happen. One thing that people barely ever talk about is that inflation is so low that, in the past, if you took out a big loan to go to school, inflation was high, your salary was increasing, it was easier to pay off that debt because you're paying it off with cheaper dollars than you borrowed it with. Inflation has been so low, and that's a major contributor to this student loan crisis, I think. So A little economic stimulus might, you know, increase inflation a little, increase some paychecks. So we'll see if that has any effect.
We're going to need to bring back our professors from the School of Business Administration from last semester to talk further into that. We've got time for just a couple more questions, so I want to get into our chat here because there's a few that are still here to address. From Ray, 3 Republican senators have decided not to run again in 2022. What is the likelihood of these seats going to the Democrats?
Oh, this is really bad news for the Republicans because these were not old members of Congress. And so to have those 3 retire, and then you've got some pretty old people that are coming up for re-election that might also need to step back. So Ohio looks like, even though Portman is resigning, that's a pretty solidly Republican state, but Democrats think they've got a good candidate. Pennsylvania could be dicey. North Carolina is dicey. So it's not a good sign for Republicans in this. It's hard to recruit moderate Republican candidates in this particular period of the Republican Party, and that's what you're going to need to win some of these Senate seats.
I think Richard Shelby from Alabama also announced that he's not going to run. So that one would be, I would imagine, a safe Republican replacement. Ohio is really interesting, right? Because it's a state, if we look at the presidential level, that's trending in the Republicans' direction, becoming more solidly Republican. And I think that's interesting because it's really, there are such similarities between Ohio, Pennsylvania, and yes, Michigan, right? Especially maybe the northern half of Ohio. Industrial manufacturing, blue collar, right? But even if we count that one for Republicans, Pennsylvania is going to be really tough. Pat Toomey is a big loss, but as you note, Nicole, it's really all about candidate recruitment. I mean, and John can speak to this maybe. The formula for winning an election is not terribly complex. Recruit good candidates, develop a good message, raise a bunch of money.
Yeah, I think, I don't know if the Republicans are going to have a terrible time. I know the Democratic lieutenant governor in Pennsylvania is thinking about running for Toomey's seat, but he's a populist, so I'm not sure Democrats are going to, if that's a win for the Democrats entirely. North Carolina, I still can't figure out. It's as we say, it's the reddest blue state or the bluest red state in the country sometimes. So I mean, Roy Cooper is won the governorship. He's a Democrat, but it's pretty hardcore Republican and conservative in many respects. It's sort of a weird combination of politics in that state.
And the other thing I'll mention there real quick, because I know we're running out of time, but these elections will happen in a midterm year, obviously, right. And the difference in electorate, the difference in the voter turnout, and the makeup of that voter turnout is so different between the presidential years and the midterm years that usually, and maybe this is changing, especially in places like North Carolina, but that usually that favors Republicans. So that might be a factor that works in their favor, but obviously way too early to tell.
Just as we close out, one final question relative certainly to most of us on this call from Andrea. Hi, Andrea. What executive action related to higher education should we expect during this time? Thoughts on that in these final 2 minutes?
From President Biden?
Yeah, she says, what executive action related to higher education should we expect? So him or his administration.
I don't know. I'm not thinking of anything respective to higher education necessarily.
The only thing I can think of is canceling all of those that were signed by Trump.
Yeah.
I think
maybe something on STEM, more support for STEM education.
I think possibly we might see something designed to combat sexual assault on campus, related to Title IX, making sure that campuses aren't a hostile environment to women.
All right, so we are just at 1 o'clock here, and I do want to make sure that we have a moment to certainly thank our panelists, Dr. Matthew, Dr. Klemanski, Dr. Dulio. Thank you again. As usual, it's been very fascinating listening to the three of you go around on these topics, and we definitely appreciate your participation today. So we are really excited. As I mentioned at the very beginning of this session, we have 3 office hour sessions that we were offering this semester. This was the first one today. And then coming up on March 18th, we're going to be speaking with some of our members of the School of Education and Human Services faculty about race relations and having sensitive conversations and authentic conversations around race. And then on April 8th, we are going to be welcoming Dr. Terry Orbuch from the Department of Sociology. She is going to be talking about polarization and the pandemic. So how do we have and maintain our personal relationships with friends and family when there are so many topics out there that lead to polarization? So we're really excited to be able to offer those and provide them to you all as we proceed through the rest of this winter semester. You can find more information about those at oakland.edu/alumni. And again, special thanks to the Center for Civic Engagement, the OU Alumni Association, and also the Professional and Continuing Education Department. We're all very happy, I know, to partner on this initiative. Certainly, any closing comments from our panelists today, Dr. Matthew, Dr. Dulio, Dr. Klemanski?
Just want to thank everybody for attending and participating.
Excellent. Thank you so much again for being our panelists today. To the 3 of you in political science, we appreciate that. Thank you to our audience and the great participation we had, lots of questions, and we look forward to seeing you at a future office hour session. Have a wonderful afternoon and take care.